Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The air in Fall River, Massachusetts, on the 4th of August, 1892, was thick enough to drink. It was a suffocating, wet wool blanket of heat and humidity, clinging to the skin, dampening collars, and promising no relief. It was the kind of day that frayed tempers and shortened patience, a day where the drone of insects seemed to amplify the oppressive stillness. Inside the modest house at 92 2nd Street, a house that stood as a testament to its owner's extreme frugality despite his immense wealth, the air was even heavier, stagnant with the smells of a noon meal being prepared, and the faint, lingering scent of old mutton from the day before. It was an ordinary house on an ordinary street, home to an ordinary, if somewhat strained family. But in the space of about 90 minutes that morning, within those suffocating walls, an act of such savage, incomprehensible violence would unfold, that it would tear a permanent hole in the fabric of American folklore. The act itself was pure butchery. 2 human bodies, hacked and bludgeoned beyond easy recognition, left to cool in the summer heat. The weapon of choice, a simple hatchet, wielded with a terrifying ferocity. The victims were Andrew Borden, a man whose wealth was matched only by his unpopularity, and his wife, Abby Durfee Borden. The crime scene was a puzzle of contradictions. It was a slaughterhouse contained within a locked and sealed box. No signs of forced entry, nothing of value stolen, no obvious intruder. The only other people known to be on the property were the family's maid, Bridget Sullivan, and Andrew's youngest daughter, a 32-year-old Sunday school teacher named Lizzie. From this crucible of heat, blood, and domestic quiet, a question would be forged, a question that has echoed for more than a century, whispered in schoolyards, and debated in courtrooms and dissected in books. Did she do it? This is not just the story of a famous rhyme or a grisly double murder. It's the story of how a person becomes a legend, and how a legend can obscure the truth. The name Lizzie Borden has become shorthand for a certain kind of female killer, cunning, cold, and hiding a monstrous rage behind a placid, respectable facade. But the woman herself was acquitted. A jury of her peers, 12 men, looked at the evidence, listened to the arguments, and declared her not guilty of all charges. They set her free. So how did this happen? How did the prime and only suspect in such a brutal and intimate crime walk away? Today, we will not merely retell the story of the Borden murders. We will dissect the anatomy of a Victorian mystery, an anatomy composed of circumstantial evidence, rigid social expectations, a bungled investigation, and a masterful legal defense, all of which combine to create a shroud of reasonable doubt so thick that it has never been fully penetrated. To understand the events of that August morning, you must first understand the city of Fall River and the man who had, in his own quiet way, mastered it. Fall River, in the late 19th century, was a powerhouse of the Industrial Revolution, a city of granite mills, packed shoulder to shoulder along the Quequechan River. It was a place of stark contrasts. A small, entrenched aristocracy of old Yankee families who owned the mills and banks, and a vast, sprawling population of immigrant laborers who toiled inside them. It was a city of smoke and money, of grinding poverty and ostentatious wealth, and of the rigid social codes that kept those two worlds separate. Andrew Jackson Borden belonged firmly to the world of money, but he lived as if he were terrified of poverty. He was a walking paradox. By 1892, his net worth was estimated to be around $300,000, the equivalent of nearly $10 million today. He was the president of a major bank, a director of several textile mills, and a significant commercial property owner. Yet he lived a life of astonishing parsimony. The Borden home on 2nd Street was in a respectable but unfashionable part of town, lacking the modern conveniences of gas lighting and indoor plumbing that were common in the homes of men far less wealthy. Andrew insisted on this. He saw such things as wasteful luxuries. The family ate frugal meals, often leftovers from days prior. He was a man who owned a vast kingdom of assets, but ruled from a tiny threadbare throne. This reputation for being tight-fisted, combined with his sharp business practices, made him a respected figure in the city's financial circles, but not a well-liked one. He was hard, distant, and emotionally austere, a patriarch cast from the classic Victorian mold. Into this world were born his 2 daughters, Emma and Lizzie. Their mother, Sarah, died when they were young, and their lives were forever altered when Andrew remarried 3 years later. His new wife was Abby Durfee Gray, a woman of 38, plain and stout, and never fully accepted by her stepdaughters. Lizzie and Emma, the daughters of Andrew's first and, in their eyes, only true love, called their stepmother Mrs. Borden. They never called her mother. This was not a home filled with warmth. It was a silent battleground of resentments. Partitioned by unspoken rules and emotional distance, Abby, for her part, seems to have tried, but the wall between her and the girls was impenetrable. The tension was a constant, low hum in the house. Lizzie Andrew Borden was the more visible and complex of the 2 sisters. At 32, she was a spinster, a common status for women of her class at the time, but one that surely brought its own frustrations. Outwardly, she was the model of respectable Victorian womanhood. She was deeply involved in the Central Congregational Church, teaching Sunday school and participating in various societies, like the Women's Christian Temperance Union. She was a member of charitable organizations and took an extended grand tour of Europe, a privilege afforded to few women of her era. Yet, beneath this placid surface, there were signs of a deep-seated unhappiness. She lived under the thumb of a domineering and miserly father, sharing a home with a stepmother she despised, in a house that was more a testament to his thrift than a comfortable home. She had social standing, but lacked personal autonomy and financial independence. Her older sister, Emma, was more of a shadow. 10 years Lizzie's senior, she was quieter, more reclusive. She often escaped the oppressive atmosphere of the 2nd Street house by making extended visits to friends and family in nearby towns. She played the role of the dutiful elder daughter, but her relationship with Lizzie was the central pillar of her life. They were a unit, 2 unmarried sisters bound together against their father and stepmother. The house was their cage, and they seemed to be waiting for a life that could only begin after their father was gone. The final key figure in this domestic drama was Bridget Maggie Sullivan, the family's live-in maid. An Irish immigrant in her mid-20s, she had been with the Bordens for nearly 3 years. It was a difficult position. The house was Spartan, the work was hard, and the family was peculiar. The girls called her Maggie, the name of a previous maid, a small but telling act of depersonalization. Bridget was an observer, a silent witness to the family's strange dynamics. She saw the tensions, heard the arguments, and felt the coldness that permeated the house. On the morning of August 4th, she would become the only other person in the house during the critical window of time when the murders were committed. Her testimony forming the fragile timeline upon which the entire case would be built. The humid summer of 1892 was not just uncomfortable for the Borden family, it was toxic. The weeks leading up to the murders were thick with a sense of dread, marked by a series of strange and unsettling events. the family dynamic, always strained, began to curdle into something far more volatile. At the center of this growing tension was money and property. Andrew Borden, in an act of familial preference, had recently arranged to transfer a valuable piece of property to Abby's half-sister. For Lizzie and Emma, this was a profound betrayal. It was their inheritance, their mother's legacy, being given away to Abby's side of the family. The ensuing argument was bitter. To appease his daughters, Andrew gave them rental properties of their own to manage, but the gesture did little to soothe the wounded feelings. The transaction had drawn a clear line in the sand. Andrew was providing for his wife's family, diminishing what his daughters felt was rightfully theirs. Then came the illness. Just days before the murders, on Tuesday, August 2nd, both Andrew and Abby fell violently ill with intense stomach cramps and vomiting. Abby was so convinced they were being poisoned that she went to a neighbor, Dr. Bowen, to voice her fears. She believed someone had tainted the baker's bread or the milk. Andrew, however, dismissed her concerns with his typical gruffness, refusing to see a doctor and declaring the illness was simply due to some bad fish they had eaten. Bridget the maid also fell ill. The only person in the house who remained conspicuously healthy was Lizzie. The source of the sickness was never determined, but it cast a pall of suspicion over the household. Was it a coincidence, or was it a clumsy, failed first attempt at murder? This suspicion gains a chilling credibility when viewed alongside another event. The day before the murders, on Wednesday, August 3rd, Lizzie Borden walked into Smith's drugstore in downtown Fall River. There, she attempted to purchase 10 cents worth of prussic acid, a deadly poison. She told the clerk, Eli Bentz, that she needed it to clean a sealskin cape. Bentz, knowing the substance was highly toxic and required a doctor's prescription, refused the sale. This incident would become a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Why would a woman need one of the world's most lethal poisons to clean a piece of clothing? It was a question her defense team would struggle to answer, ultimately choosing to attack the credibility of the druggist rather than explain Lizzie's actions. That same evening, another figure entered the tightly wound world of 92 2nd Street. John Vinicum Morse. Morse was the brother of Andrew Borden's deceased first wife, Sarah. He was Lizzie and Emma's maternal uncle. His arrival was not entirely unexpected, as he was in town on business, but his presence at this specific time is one of the case's most tantalizing variables. He stayed the night in the upstairs guest room, the very room where Abby Borden's body would be found the next morning. He and Andrew stayed up late, their voices heard by Bridget from her attic room, discussing business matters. The exact nature of their conversation is unknown, but it's widely believed to have concerned Andrew's will and the final disposition of his estate. With the recent property dispute still fresh, the arrival of their uncle to discuss finances could only have exacerbated Lizzie's sense of anxiety and resentment. The house on 2nd Street was now a pressure cooker, filled with suspicion, financial anxiety, and a simmering, murderous rage. The stage was set. The morning of Thursday, August 4th dawned as hot and heavy as the day before. The routine of the Borden household began as it always did. John Morse and Andrew Borden were up early, joining Abby for breakfast around 7. Lizzie did not come down to eat with them, a common occurrence. Bridget Sullivan prepared the meal: mutton broth, leftover mutton, bananas, coffee, and johnny cakes, and then went back to her own breakfast in the kitchen. After the meal, around 8 o'clock, John Morse left the house to visit other relatives, planning to return for the noon meal. Andrew Borden set off for his morning rounds of the downtown banks and businesses he owned. This left 3 women in the house: Abby Borden, Lizzie Borden, and Bridget Sullivan. The timeline of what happened next is based almost entirely on Bridget's testimony, a patchwork of chores and brief interactions that investigators would later scrutinize down to the minute. After cleaning the breakfast dishes, Bridget went outside to the backyard to wash the home's exterior windows, a miserable task in the sweltering heat. While she was outside, she saw Lizzie. Around 9 o'clock, Abby came downstairs and instructed Bridget to do the washing. She then went back upstairs to the guest room where her uncle had stayed to change the linens. It was the last time anyone would see her alive. For the next hour and a half, the house was a place of fractured activity. Bridget was outside, scrubbing windows. Lizzie, by her own account, was in and out of the house, going to the barn in the backyard for a brief period to look for lead sinkers for a planned fishing trip. This trip to the barn is a critical and highly contested piece of her alibi. She claimed to have been there for 20 to 30 minutes, eating pears, and looking for the fishing equipment. The police would later find the barn loft to be stiflingly hot and covered in dust, making it seem an unlikely place for a woman in a dress to spend any significant amount of time. Nevertheless, that was her story. Around 10:30 a.m., Andrew Borden returned home from his walk. He struggled with the front door lock, so Bridget, who was now inside washing the interior windows, let him in. She testified that she heard Lizzie laugh from the top of the stairs as her father fumbled with the key. Andrew went into the sitting room, and Lizzie came downstairs to speak with him. She mentioned that Mrs. Borden had received a note and had gone out to visit a sick friend. This supposed note was never found, and no sick friend ever came forward. It is widely considered to be a fabrication, a lie told to explain her stepmother's absence and to establish a time frame for when an intruder could have entered the house unseen. After her brief conversation with her father, Andrew lay down on the horsehair sofa in the sitting room for a nap. It was a common habit for him. Bridget finished her windows and went up to her small room on the 3rd floor to rest before starting the midday meal. It was just after 11 o'clock. The house fell quiet. Andrew Borden was asleep on the sofa. Abby Borden was dead or dying on the floor of the guest room above him. Bridget was in her attic room. And Lizzie was somewhere in the house alone with her sleeping father. The quiet was shattered just a few minutes later by a frantic cry from downstairs. "Maggie, come down quick, Father's dead. Somebody came in and killed him." Bridget rushed down the 2 flights of stairs to find a scene of surreal horror. Andrew Borden was slumped on the sofa, his head and face a pulpy, unrecognizable mess of blood and bone. One eye was sliced cleanly in half, his nose was severed, and his face was covered in at least 10 distinct crushing blows. The blood had not sprayed widely. It had mostly soaked into his clothing and the dark fabric of the sofa, but the sheer brutality of the attack was breathtaking. The weapon, a hatchet or a similar sharp, heavy instrument, had been wielded with savage force. Lizzie was standing nearby, strangely composed. She sent Bridget to get Dr. Bowen, the family physician who lived across the street. While Bridget was gone, a neighbor, Adelaide Churchill, came over after hearing the commotion. She saw Andrew's body and asked Lizzie where her stepmother was. Lizzie repeated her story about the note, saying, "She has gone out. She had a note. Somebody's sick." She then added a chillingly prophetic statement, "I am afraid Mrs. Borden is killed also, for I thought I heard her come in." At Mrs. Churchill's urging, Bridget was sent upstairs to check. The maid, terrified, refused to go alone, so Mrs. Churchill accompanied her. They went up the main staircase, checked the master bedroom, and then moved to the guest room at the front of the house. There, lying face down on the floor between the bed and the dresser, was the body of Abby Borden. She had been struck from behind, a total of 19 times. The first blow, to the back of the head, would have rendered her unconscious instantly, and she fell forward onto the floor. The killer then straddled her body and continued the frenzied attack, hacking at her skull until it was a shattered ruin. The scene was even more brutal than the one downstairs. The blood had congealed and darkened, and her body was cool to the touch. Dr. Bowen arrived and quickly confirmed what was obvious. Both Andrew and Abby Borden were dead, murdered in their own home, in broad daylight, with a level of violence that stunned the entire city of Fall River. The locked door mystery had begun. The immediate aftermath of the discoveries was pure chaos. Neighbors, police officers, doctors, and curiosity seekers flooded into the small house, contaminating what was already a difficult crime scene. The Fall River Police Department in 1892 was not equipped for a homicide investigation of this complexity. Their methods were rudimentary, and crucial mistakes were made in the first few hours. Evidence was moved, the scene was not properly secured, and the initial interviews were haphazard. In this swirl of confusion, Lizzie Borden remained the calm center. Her demeanor was noted by almost everyone who encountered her. She was not hysterical or weeping. She was eerily placid, answering questions in a detached manner while her father and stepmother lay murdered in the next rooms. The initial theory from the police was that the crime was the work of an outsider, perhaps a disgruntled business associate of Andrew's, or a crazed transient. They searched the property for signs of forced entry, but found none. They searched for a murder weapon, but turned up nothing definitive. They searched for any person who might have been seen entering or leaving the house, but no credible witnesses came forward. The more they searched for an external explanation, the more the focus began to turn inward, toward the three people who were on the property at the time of the killings: Bridget, John Morse, and Lizzie. Bridget Sullivan had a plausible alibi. Multiple witnesses could attest to her being outside washing windows during the time Abby was likely killed. For the murder of Andrew, she was in her third-floor room, a location that made it difficult, though not impossible, for her to have committed the crime and returned to her room without being seen or heard. John Morse also had a strong alibi. He had been visiting relatives across town and was seen by multiple people. That left Lizzie. Her story was flimsy and full of holes. Her alibi for the time of her stepmother's murder rested on her uncorroborated claim of being in the barn. For her father's murder, she claimed to be in the kitchen, just feet away from where he was brutally slain, yet she insisted she heard nothing. The forensic evidence, or rather, the glaring lack of it, became the central paradox of the case. The murders were incredibly bloody affairs. The killer, swinging a hatchet with immense force, would have almost certainly been spattered with blood, especially during the second, more frenzied attack on Abby. Yet when the first responders arrived, Lizzie's clothes were pristine. There was not a single drop of blood on her. This became the single most powerful point in her favor. The prosecution could only speculate. Had she worn a protective garment, like a cloak or an apron, which she later hid or destroyed? Had she committed the murders in the nude? These were theories, but they were just that, theories with no evidence to support them. The investigation uncovered two key pieces of circumstantial evidence that would form the pillars of the case against her. The first was her attempt to purchase prussic acid the day before the murders. The second came a few days after the crime. On Sunday, August 7th, Lizzie's friend, Alice Russell, who was staying in the house to comfort her, witnessed Lizzie systematically tearing apart a blue cotton dress and burning the pieces in the kitchen stove. When Alice asked her what she was doing, Lizzie casually replied that she was destroying it because it was old and covered in paint. This act, the deliberate destruction of clothing just days after a bloody murder for which she was the primary suspect, was seen by the prosecution as a clear admission of guilt. She was burning the dress she had worn during the killings. As the investigation intensified, Lizzie was called to testify at an inquest. Her testimony was a disaster. Over the course of several hours, she gave a series of bizarre, contradictory, and often nonsensical answers. She couldn't seem to keep her story straight about where she was and what she was doing that morning. She claimed to be in the dining room when her father arrived home, then said she was upstairs. She offered vague and conflicting details. She seemed confused and disoriented. So damaging was this testimony that her own defense team would later have it ruled inadmissible at her trial, arguing that she was under the influence of morphine prescribed by her doctor to calm her nerves and was therefore not of sound mind. But for the police and the public, the inquest sealed her fate. On August 11th, 1 week after the murders, Lizzie Borden, the respectable Sunday school teacher, was arrested and charged with the murders of her father and stepmother. The trial of Lizzie Borden, which began in June of 1893 in the nearby city of New Bedford, was nothing short of a national spectacle. It was the O.J. Simpson trial of its day, a media circus that captivated the entire country. Newspapers from Boston to San Francisco sent their best reporters to cover the proceedings, and the courtroom was packed every day with society ladies, legal scholars, and curious onlookers. The case had all the elements of a great drama: a brutal crime, a wealthy family, a mysterious female defendant, and a shocking lack of hard evidence. Public opinion was sharply divided. To some, she was a cold-blooded monster. To others, she was a tragic victim of circumstance, a gentlewoman railroaded by a biased police force. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Hosea Knowlton, built its case on a chain of circumstantial evidence. They had motive: Lizzie's deep-seated hatred for her stepmother and her desire for financial independence. They had opportunity. She was in the house at the time of both murders. They had evidence of premeditation, her attempt to buy poison just the day before. And they had evidence of a cover-up, her burning of the dress. Knowlton's strategy was to paint a psychological portrait of Lizzie as a woman capable of immense rage, a woman who felt trapped and resentful, who finally snapped and unleashed her fury on the two people who represented the source of her misery. The prosecution's star witness was Bridget Sullivan, who laid out the timeline of the morning's events. However, under cross-examination, the defense was able to poke holes in her memory and highlight minor inconsistencies. The prosecution also presented the handleless hatchet head that had been found in the basement, its wooden handle conveniently broken off. They argued this was the murder weapon, cleaned of blood but still bearing traces of ash, suggesting it had been deliberately wiped clean to demonstrate the nature of the wounds. The actual skulls of Andrew and Abby Borden, which had been cleaned and preserved after the autopsy, were presented to the jury in a moment of high courtroom drama. It was a shocking and macabre display, intended to horrify the jury and convince them of the killer's monstrous nature. Lizzie's defense was orchestrated by a legal dream team headed by George D. Robinson, the highly respected former governor of Massachusetts. Their strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. First, they relentlessly attacked the police investigation, highlighting every mistake and every piece of mishandled evidence. They emphasized that no proper search of Lizzie was conducted immediately after the crime, and the house itself was not secured. Second, they dismantled the prosecution's evidence piece by piece. They argued the hatchet head couldn't be the weapon because its dimensions didn't perfectly match the wounds. They brought in witnesses to suggest the dress Lizzie burned was indeed stained with paint, not blood. They savaged the credibility of the druggist who claimed Lizzie tried to buy poison. Their most powerful strategy, however, was not legal but cultural. They presented Lizzie Borden to the all-male jury not as a potential killer, but as the idealized Victorian woman. Throughout the trial, Lizzie sat demurely in court, dressed in black, often holding a fan or a bouquet of flowers. Looking frail and distraught, her church pastor sat with her every day. A symbol of her piety and moral character, Governor Robinson, in his closing argument, painted a picture that resonated deeply with the jury's preconceived notions of gender and class. How could a woman, a gentle church-going spinster from a good family, possibly possess the physical strength and the moral depravity to commit such a heinous act? He argued it was simply impossible, an offense against nature and God. He famously declared, "To find her guilty, you must believe she is a fiend. Gentlemen, does she look it?" The defense also capitalized on the single greatest weakness in the prosecution's case: the complete absence of blood evidence linking Lizzie to the crime. How could she have bludgeoned two people nearly 30 times and emerged without a single spot of blood on her person or her clothing? The prosecution had no answer, only speculation. This, more than anything else, created the space for reasonable doubt. The jury was faced with a choice. Either they could believe that this respectable woman in front of them was a monstrous anomaly, a killer of unprecedented cunning who had somehow managed to commit a perfect bloodless crime, or they could believe that the police had simply failed to find the real killer, an unknown intruder who had slipped in and out of the house unseen. On June 20, 1893, after deliberating for only 90 minutes, the jury returned with its verdict. As the foreman uttered the words, "Not guilty," the courtroom erupted. Lizzie Borden collapsed, seemingly in relief, and the crowd outside cheered. She was a free woman. The legal system had spoken, but the court of public opinion was far from finished with her. Lizzie Borden won her freedom, but she never regained her life. After the trial, she and her sister Emma inherited the entirety of their father's considerable fortune. They left the claustrophobic house on 2nd Street and purchased a grand, modern mansion in the fashionable part of Fall River, a neighborhood known as The Hill. Lizzie christened the new home Maplecroft, and began to live the life of wealth and social standing she had likely always craved. She bought fine clothes, traveled and hosted parties for artists and actors, a bohemian crowd that scandalized the conservative elite of the city, but she remained a pariah. The society of Fall River, the very society whose patriarchal values had helped to acquit her, now turned its back on her. She was snubbed on the street, whispered about in drawing rooms, and ostracized by the community she had once been a part of. The children of the town would chant the now famous rhyme as she passed by. Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. The acquittal had freed her from prison, but it had condemned her to a different kind of life sentence, one of perpetual suspicion and social isolation. In 1905, the final pillar of her old life crumbled. Emma, her steadfast sister and supporter, abruptly moved out of Maplecroft and never spoke to Lizzie again. The reason for their final dramatic split is unknown, though rumors swirled about a party Lizzie had thrown for an actress that Emma found unseemly. Whatever the cause, the two sisters, who had been bound together by the trauma of their family life and the ordeal of the trial, were permanently estranged. Lizzie Borden lived out the rest of her days in the grand house on the hill, a wealthy but profoundly lonely woman. She died in 1927 at the age of 66. By a strange coincidence of fate, her sister Emma died just 9 days later in a different town. They were buried side by side in the family plot, reunited in death as they had not been in their final years of life. So what is the ultimate anatomy of this enduring mystery? Why does the question of Lizzie Borden's guilt or innocence still fascinate us over a century later? The answer lies in the perfect storm of its components. It is a story built on a foundation of doubt. The investigation was flawed from the start, conducted with the primitive forensic tools of the 19th century, and a level of carelessness that would be unthinkable today. Key evidence was contaminated or simply overlooked. This initial failure created an evidentiary vacuum at the heart of the case. Into this vacuum poured the powerful social biases of the Victorian era. The idea that a woman of Lizzie's class and supposed piety could commit such a violent, unfeminine act was, for many, literally inconceivable. Her defense team masterfully exploited this prejudice, turning the trial into a referendum on the nature of womanhood. They presented the jury with a caricature of feminine innocence, and the jury chose to believe it over the mountain of circumstantial evidence that pointed toward her guilt. They acquitted the symbol, not necessarily the person. And finally, there is Lizzie herself. She remains an enigma. Her conflicting statements, her strange composure, and her actions both before and after the murders paint a portrait of a deeply complex and possibly sociopathic individual. If she was innocent, she was the victim of a series of unbelievable coincidences. If she was guilty, she was a performer of breathtaking skill. A woman who managed to fool the police, the public, and a jury of 12 men, committing a near-perfect crime and then brazenly lying about it with ice in her veins. She left behind no confession, no diary, no deathbed revelation. She took her secrets with her to the grave. The case of Lizzie Borden is not just an unsolved murder. It is a permanent fixture in the American psyche. It is a dark fairy tale about the secrets that fester behind the closed doors of a seemingly normal family. Over the years, countless theories have been proposed. That Bridget the maid was the killer, that Lizzie and Bridget were lovers and committed the crimes together, that her uncle John Morse was the culprit, or even that Lizzie suffered from epileptic seizures that caused her to act in a violent fugue state. None of these theories have ever been substantiated. All that remains is the brutal, unanswered truth of what happened in that house. The name Lizzie Borden has become unmoored from the historical person. It has transformed into a symbol, a chilling piece of folklore that reminds us that sometimes the most monstrous acts are committed not by shadowy strangers, but by the quiet, familiar faces we see every day. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.